Hello, welcome to Weekly Forex Outlook for Friday, April the 12th. I'm Rafi Boyajan, currency analyst, and with me is our chief economist, Michalis Sorenjadis. So Michalis, it was a mostly positive week for the markets. We saw yet more encouraging headlines regarding trade talks between the US and China. We also had some fairly positive data both out of the US and the Eurozone. We also saw the no-deal Brexit being averted, at least for the time being. And yet we saw most major pairs being stuck in their recent ranges, but though the US dollar did come under some selling pressure. So please, can you explain what were behind those moves this past week?
Yes, it was a little bit strange in the fact that we had fairly major risk events. This was, of course, the EU summit on Brexit, the Fed minutes and some US data that you talked about, and of course the ECB meeting. But this did not result in a lot of volatility. Starting with the British pound, it seems that a long extension to Brexit was pretty much baked in the cake for the pound. So it was what the market had expected. So there wasn't not even a relief rally that maybe was reasonable to expect a relief rally on this on the outcome of the EU summit. Sterling more or less stayed the same. Of course, there are those that say that the uncertainty is just being prolonged. So that's another way of looking at it. Now, the US dollar was, as you said, under pressure this week. Although we didn't have any really bad news about the US dollar, I think that the fact that the core inflation in the US was a little bit softer than was anticipated, showed a little bit softer picture. And on the other hand, I think the ECB was not as specific as some might have hoped with respect to stimulus measures. Maybe this has a little bit to do with this meeting being a meeting without updated economic projections. So maybe or probably we're going to see some action in their next meeting in June. Nevertheless, the euro did benefit a little bit from this lack of concrete action, and the ECB saying more that it was planning to come up with more specific measures in its future meetings. Having said that, the stock markets were down a little bit because we are entering earnings season in the US. So what do we have to look for next week? What are likely to be the key highlights?
Well, it's going to be somewhat of a shorter week next. We've got the Easter break next Friday, but there's going to be plenty of data coming up. We're going to have job numbers out of Australia and as well as the RBA meeting minutes. The Aussie did touch fresh highs against the US dollar this past week. We had a speech from the RBA's deputy governor who basically once again brought into light the RBA's hesitance to shift to a dovish stance. So if the minutes further point in this direction as well, we could see the Aussie perhaps gaining further in the coming week. More importantly, for the Aussie perhaps could be the GDP numbers out of China next week. For the first quarter, we are expecting a further slowdown in Chinese growth to 6.3% a year on year. That would probably be the slowest since possibly way before the 1990s. Though it's mostly been priced into the market, so unless we see a big surprise in the numbers, we're not expecting any major reaction, especially as we're seeing progress being made in the trade talks. Inflation numbers will also come out of New Zealand, Japan, the UK, the final CPI estimates for the Eurozone. In other data for the Eurozone, we're going to have the flash PMIs. Those will be important. This week we saw a positive surprise in French and Italian industrial production numbers. So if the flash PMIs next week for the Eurozone further indicate a possible turnaround in Eurozone growth. That could give the euro a further lift. You mentioned the euro benefited this week from the ECB meeting. In the UK, we're going to have finally a bit of an absence in the Brexit headlines. So we could see data attracting a bit more attention. We're going to have UK job numbers, inflation, and retail sales. Retail sales are also out of the US, but other than that, the US will be relatively quiet. We will focus, other than this retail sales, will be the manufacturing surveys for April.
I think it's interesting what I would say that the highlights are that of course it might, because of the holiday shortened week, the fact that Easter is approaching, a major holiday for a lot of Western countries, that maybe the markets are going to be a little bit more quiet. At the same time, maybe liquidity is going to be a little lower and we will have sharper moves. But I think it's also interesting that while the Chinese slowdown is happening and is being priced in, at the same time it's not as dramatic as feared. And I think this, together with optimism regarding the trade talks, might have pushed the Aussie to new levels, to rally more or less. So this is and Aussie has been under pressure for quite some time. So it's interesting to see the currency rallying. So thank you very much, Rafi, for your input. Thank you everyone for watching and have a great day.